Welcome to Let's Run It Back. Alright, let's talk about console wars. Not the ones we have today, where people argue over which system has slightly better resolution or which company bought more exclusives, but the real console wars. The kind where you had to pick a side and stick with it. The kind where owning a Sega Genesis meant something different than owning a Super Nintendo. Back in the 90s, the console wars weren't just about specs. They were about identity. They were about completely different gaming experiences depending on which system you had. Developers didn't just port a game over with slightly better textures. They made entirely different versions of the same game for different consoles. That meant you could play Aladdin on the SNES and Aladdin on the Genesis and get two completely different games. That doesn't happen anymore. Today, gaming feels safer. We get the same AAA blockbusters on PlayStation, Xbox, and PC. The competition feels more corporate, more about numbers and less about rivalry. But back in the 90s, the console wars were personal. So let's run it back and talk about why the console wars of the 90s were the greatest era of gaming competition. We'll go through every major generation and break down why those battles were more intense, more fun, and more meaningful than what we have today.
Awesome! Intense.
The Nintendo Entertainment System. Your parents help you hook it up.
Before the real console wars started, the late 80s saw the first signs of competition between two companies, Nintendo and Sega. In 1985, the Nintendo Entertainment System, NES, single-handedly revived the video game industry after the Atari crash of 1983. Back then, the gaming industry was in shambles. Atari flooded the market with low-quality, unfinished games, looking at UET, causing massive consumer distrust. Retailers started pulling video games off shelves because they weren't selling. Many believed home gaming was dead. Arcades were still alive, but consoles, not looking good. Then Nintendo came in and changed everything. They enforced quality control on their games through the Nintendo Seal of Approval, meaning no more rushed, broken games. They created some of the most iconic franchises of all time. Super Mario Bros., 1985, The Legend of Zelda, 1986, Metroid, 1986. They locked down third-party developers, making sure companies like Capcom and Konami couldn't release games on other consoles. This gave Nintendo a huge monopoly over the industry. If you wanted to play Mega Man, Castlevania, or Final Fantasy, you had to buy an NES. Enter the Sega Master System, 1986, a technically more powerful console that should have been a serious competitor. It had better graphics, more colors, and solid arcade ports like Outrun and Shinobi. The problem? No third-party support. Since Nintendo had locked developers into exclusive deals, Sega was forced to rely on its own IPs. Everyone knew Mario, but who was Alex Kidd? The result? The Master System lost badly, but Sega wasn't giving up. They learned from their mistakes, and when they came back for round two, they went on the attack.
Genesis does
16-bit arcade graphics.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does.
Now this is where the console wars truly hit their peak. The 8-bit generation was a slaughter. The NES crushed the Sega Master System, and there was no real back and forth. But when the Sega Genesis, Mega Drive outside the US, launched in 1989, Sega wasn't playing around anymore. This was the most competitive generation in gaming history. The Genesis and Super Nintendo went head-to-head for years, trading blows with game releases, exclusive deals, and completely different versions of the same game that made owning a particular console feel like an actual choice. Unlike today, where a multi-platform game is basically the same no matter where you play it, back then, a Super Nintendo version and a Genesis version could be two entirely different games. But before we get into that, let's set the stage. Genesis does what Nintendon't. Sega fires the first shot, 1989-1991. In 1989, while Nintendo was still riding the success of the NES, Sega dropped the Sega Genesis, a 16-bit powerhouse that made 8-bit games look ancient. Sega knew they couldn't beat Nintendo by playing fair. Instead, they went all in on being the cool console for older kids and teenagers. Their marketing was aggressive and directly called out Nintendo, Genesis Does What Nintendon't. That's not just competition. That's straight up trash talk. And for a while, it worked. The Genesis had a faster processor, meaning it could handle faster-paced action games than the NES. It had better arcade ports. Sega positioned itself as the console for mature gamers, with sports games, arcade-style action, and bloodier games. And most importantly, Sega had Sonic. Sonic the Hedgehog, 1991, was a game changer. Faster, more colorful, and packed with attitude, Sonic was Sega's direct answer to Super Mario Bros. But Nintendo wasn't going to sit back and let Sega take over. Nintendo strikes back. The Super Nintendo arrives 1991-1996. In 1991, Nintendo fired back with the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, SNES. And while Sega had a head start, the SNES had superior hardware in almost every way. The Super Nintendo had a 256-color palette compared to the Genesis's 64 colors. Better sound and music. Thanks to its Sony-designed sound chip, the Super Nintendo had orchestral-quality music. Mode 7 graphics. This allowed for pseudo 3D effects, making games like F-Zero, Super Mario Kart, and Pilot Wings feel revolutionary. And the games? Absolute legends. At this point, the console war was a true rivalry. The Genesis had an edgier, faster library, while the Super Nintendo had higher quality, more polished games. But one of the coolest things about this era was how the same game could be a totally different experience depending on which console you had. Unlike today, where multi-platform games are practically identical on every system, the 16-bit era was full of games that looked, played, and even sounded completely different depending on whether you had a Super Nintendo or a Genesis. Let's break down some of the biggest examples of this. Aladdin, 1993. Super Nintendo versus Genesis. Two completely different games, two different developers, two different styles. The Super Nintendo version, made by Capcom, was a smooth, acrobatic platformer. The Genesis version, made by Virgin Interactive, was a faster, action-based game where Aladdin had a sword. The Genesis version used hand-drawn animation from actual Disney animators, making it look just like the movie. The Super Nintendo version played more like Super Mario Bros., with tighter platforming mechanics. People still argue about which version was better, but one thing's for sure. They weren't just the same game with minor changes. Mortal Kombat, 1992, Super Nintendo versus Genesis. The Super Nintendo version had better graphics and sound, but no blood. Instead, characters sweat when they were hit. The Genesis version looked slightly worse, but had a secret blood code. This made the Genesis version feel more like the arcade, while the SNES version felt watered down. Because of this, Sega won the battle for Mortal Kombat. But by Mortal Kombat 2, Nintendo learned its lesson and included full blood and fatalities. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Tournament Fighters, 1993. Super Nintendo versus Genesis versus the NES. This wasn't just one game with minor differences. This was three completely different games. The Super Nintendo version was a Street Fighter-style fighter with different characters like Asuka and Chrome Dome. The Genesis version had a different roster and darker, grittier graphics. The NES version was a completely different 8-bit fighting game that wasn't even remotely similar. Imagine if today, Street Fighter VI had three completely different versions depending on what console you played it on. That just doesn't happen anymore. Earthworm Jim, 1994. Super Nintendo versus Genesis. Another case where the same game had completely different strengths. The Super Nintendo version had better graphics and color. The Genesis version had better music because of the way the sound chip worked. Some levels were slightly redesigned, making each version feel distinct. NBA Jam, 1993. Super Nintendo versus Genesis. Even a sports game could feel different. The Genesis version had faster gameplay. The Super Nintendo version had better sound and voice samples. Some cheat codes worked only on certain versions. These subtle differences made owning a specific console feel important. It wasn't just about graphics. It was about which version of the game you preferred. The verdict: Who won the 16-bit war? By 1994, the Super Nintendo had caught up to and eventually outsold the Genesis, thanks to its stronger first-party lineup and superior hardware. But the truth is, we all won. The Super Nintendo versus Genesis era gave us some of the most unique gaming experiences ever, and the competition pushed both companies to be better.
Boy, Mustache Man, your worst nightmare has arrived.
Pack up your stuff. I got a little surprise for you here.
If the Super Nintendo versus Genesis war was all about the best 2D gaming experience, the next console war was about who could bring gaming into the third dimension the best. This was a pivotal moment in gaming history. The transition from 2D sprites to full 3D worlds wasn't just an upgrade, it was a revolution. Unlike today, where hardware is all about incremental improvements, the jump from 16-bit to 32-bit and 64-bit was a massive leap. Consoles were no longer limited to side-scrolling or top-down perspectives. Now you could explore fully realized 3D worlds. And just like before, we had three major players battling it out. Sony PlayStation, 1994, Japan, and 1995 worldwide. The cool new challenger that no one saw coming. Nintendo 64, 1996. The veteran king of the gaming industry, making the risky decision to stick with cartridges instead of CDs. Sega Saturn, 1994, Japan, and 1995 worldwide. Sega's attempt to keep up, but with some of the worst decisions in console history. The battle for 3D gaming. How the console war changed the industry. By the mid-90s, gaming wasn't just about better graphics and sound anymore. It was about who could create the best 3D experiences. Each company took a completely different approach to this problem. When Sony announced the PlayStation, nobody took them seriously. After all, Sony wasn't a gaming company. They were known for electronics, music, and movies. But their entrance into gaming was actually the result of a failed deal with Nintendo. Sony and Nintendo's betrayal. The origin of the PlayStation. Originally, Sony and Nintendo were supposed to work together on a CD-based add-on for the Super Nintendo called the Super Nintendo PlayStation. But at the last minute, Nintendo backed out and decided to work with Philips instead, leading to one of the worst business moves in gaming history. Instead of scrapping the idea, Sony said, "Screw it, we'll make our own console." And that's how the Sony PlayStation was born. The PlayStation's strength CD-ROM format. While Nintendo stuck with cartridges, Sony went all in on CDs, which could hold way more data and cost far less to produce. Third-party dominance. Developers flocked to PlayStation because CDs were cheaper to make. Sony had no licensing restrictions. Unlike Nintendo's strict policies, it was easier to develop for than the Sega Saturn. Marketing to teens and adults. Sony didn't just market to kids. They made gaming feel like an entertainment medium for everyone. Sony's game-changing lineup. Some of PlayStation's biggest exclusives. Final Fantasy VII, 1997. This game alone sold millions of consoles and proved that Sony was a real competitor. Metal Gear Solid, 1998, the first cinematic stealth action game. Resident Evil, 1996, brought survival horror to mainstream audiences. Gran Turismo, 1997, a realistic racing sim that no other console could match. Tekken 3, 1997, the best 3D fighting game of its time. By 1997, it was clear the PlayStation was dominating, but Nintendo wasn't giving up. The Nintendo 64 was Nintendo's most ambitious console ever. While Sony and Sega were moving to CDs, Nintendo decided to stick with cartridges, a decision that was both a blessing and a curse. The pros of cartridges. Faster load times. Unlike CDs, which had long loading screens, cartridges loaded instantly. No skipping or scratching. CDs were fragile, but cartridges were durable. Better anti-piracy protection. Pirating CD games was easy. Copying cartridges, much harder. The cons of cartridges' limited storage. A CD could hold 650 MB of data, while an N64 cartridge maxed out at 64 MB. That's a 10x difference. Higher costs. Cartridges were more expensive to manufacture, meaning fewer games could be made. lost third-party support. Many developers, including Squaresoft, Capcom, and Konami, ditched Nintendo for PlayStation, but Nintendo still had the best first-party games. What saved the N64 was its legendary lineup of exclusives. Super Mario 64, 1996, the most influential 3D platformer ever. The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, 1998, considered by many to be the greatest game ever made. Mario Kart 64, 1997, the king of multiplayer racing. GoldenEye 007, 1997, the first truly great console FPS. Super Smash Bros., 1999, a fighting game that created a whole new genre. Despite these incredible exclusives, the PlayStation still won the war because it had more third-party support and cheaper games. If you thought the Genesis versus Super Nintendo war was close, the triple threat match between Saturn, PlayStation, and N64 war was a complete slaughter. Sega had every chance to succeed, but they made one terrible mistake after another. What went wrong with the Saturn? It was rushed to market. Sega panicked when they saw Sony's PlayStation and released the Saturn early, catching developers off guard. It was insanely hard to develop, for the complex hardware made it a nightmare for developers. It had weak third-party support. With PlayStation offering CDs and Nintendo dominating first-party games, Sega had no real advantage. It was overpriced. The Saturn launched at $399, while the PlayStation was only $299. The Saturn had some great games, but it wasn't enough. Virtua Fighter 2, 1995, one of the best 3D fighter of its time. Panzer Dragoon Saga, 1998, one of the greatest RPGs ever, but barely anyone played it. Nights into Dreams, 1996, a creative, visually stunning platformer. By 1998, the Saturn was dead in the water. Who won the 3D war? Sony PlayStation, clear winner. Over 102 million units sold. Nintendo 64, great first-party games, but lost third-party support. Over 32 million units sold. Sega Saturn, total failure, less than 10 million units sold. Sega was so crushed by this loss that they eventually exited the console business completely after the Dreamcast. Why the 16-bit and 32-bit wars were the peak of console gaming rivalries. If we're being real, gaming competition has never been better than it was during the 16-bit and 32-bit console wars. This was the golden age of gaming rivalries, when every console wasn't just another box that played the same games, but an entirely different experience based on the system you had. Sega Genesis versus Super Nintendo wasn't just about power, it was about identity. If you wanted fast-paced, arcade-style action, you picked Genesis. If you wanted colorful, detailed graphics and deep gameplay, you picked Super Nintendo. And the best part? The same game could be completely different depending on what system you owned. Aladdin, Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter II, Earthworm Jim, every game felt unique to each console. That's something we just don't get anymore. And once gaming moved into 3D, the wars didn't slow down. In fact, they became even more cutthroat. Why the 32-64-bit war was the best 3D battle. This was the Wild West of 3D gaming. Nobody had figured out the right way to make 3D games yet, so every system took a different approach. PlayStation went with cinematic, story-driven games, and it paid off. Nintendo 64 pushed gameplay innovation with Super Mario 64 and Zelda, Ocarina of Time. Sega Saturn had arcade-perfect graphics, but the poor marketing and complicated hardware doomed it. Even within the same franchises, different consoles got different versions. Resident Evil 2 and N64 looked completely different from the PlayStation version. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater played way smoother on PlayStation, but had an exclusive 4-player mode on N64. Turok was an N64 exclusive FPS, while PlayStation had Metal Gear Solid, two completely different takes on action games. This wasn't just a war about specs, it was a battle of ideas, the end of true console wars. Unfortunately, after the 32-bit, 64-bit era, things started to change. Sega collapsed with the Dreamcast, leaving us with PlayStation, Nintendo, and Microsoft's Xbox. And while competition still exists today, it just doesn't feel the same. Most games today are identical across platforms. You're not picking a system for a completely different version of a game. You're picking it based on minor hardware differences. And marketing? It's nowhere near as ruthless as Genesis Does What Nintendon't, or Sony dropping the price of the PlayStation just to humiliate Sega at E3. The console wars of the 90s weren't just about brand loyalty. They were about real meaningful differences between each system. If you had a Super Nintendo, a Genesis, a PlayStation, or an N64, you were getting an experience you couldn't get anywhere else. And that's why the 90s console wars will always be the best. But what do you think? Were the 16-bit and 32-bit console wars the peak of gaming competition? Or do you think today's gaming wars still have something special? Let me know in the comments. Big shout out to our Throwback Influencer channel members, Mary Gerald, Jeremy Bowen, Thicula, iCritic, and Revan Lockhart. Your support means everything. Channel members get early access to videos at least 24 hours before everyone else. So if you want to be first in line for new content, consider joining. And if you want to support the channel even further, check out the Let's Run It Back merch shop to grab some nostalgic gear. If you love these nostalgic deep dives, make sure to like and subscribe for more. As always, keep the nostalgia alive.